So that's a cell phone video the owner of this 59 Bassman reissue sent to me. And as you can tell, there is a drum kit there in the room, and it was hard for me to tell whether the problem he was showing was solely in the amp or maybe the snare ringing out sympathetically. Now, I know the player, he's a very experienced guy. He knows the difference between snare drum sympathetic resonance and the amp. And so do I, but just because it's not clear in the video, I wanted to recreate that for you guys here. So let me show you a trick to know when the amp is not filtering correctly. You hear that fuzzy nastiness? And listen to this synth. Hopefully that comes across. It's really beating against itself. Here how there are strong notes and weak notes. So those are the symptoms. And I expect when we open this up, we're going to find some very common failure modes in all the Fender reissues. Now, this 59 Bassman LTD is one of the better reissues they've done. It still has some changes to the original as far as voltages go that aren't so great. And it has, crucially, IC brand caps, and I bet that's what we're hearing right now. Those ICs are probably failed. And let's take a look inside and see if I'm right. Well, after a bit of a minor struggle to get the chassis out of the cabinet due to 2 bent screws, and the T-nut that's supposed to hold this bracket in place had come loose from the wood, so it was just spinning around, and I had to get up there and hold it just right with my fingers because I couldn't fit in a tool, so I had to manually fight a stripped screw and a loose T-nut. I would have showed that, but YouTube does have some standards for language and such, so it's best just left to people's imagination. I'll dust all this off, of course. The IC brand caps are not visibly leaking. That does not mean that they're any damn good. There's some more inside I'll show you in just a minute. But that sound that I heard is the sound of not enough filtering. And this amp in stock form should have plenty. What they're doing in the reissue, the original just had 4 20 microfarad caps, the first 2 in parallel, and then an 8 microfarad. This has got 200 microfarad, 350 volts in series for the first node. That takes us to 50 microfarad, pretty close to the original 40. And then they have 2 47s in series, which brings us to 23.5, which is, again, very close to the original 20. This just handles a higher B+. This amp does tend to have a higher B+ than the old ones. And I will see what I can do to address that a small amount without doing anything radical. Let's take a look inside. Here are the other 3 filter caps. This one in the stock, the old amp would have been 8. It can be a 10. 22 is not a bad substitute. It makes sense. It's just not exactly the right circuit. In other ways, this amp is actually very accurate to the circuit. It just has the same issues a lot of the reissue stuff does, with very long bits of wire here and there. This is a different pot layout. It's got full-size pots mounted to this PCB. Not a real problem there. There are things I can do to upgrade some components, but it's probably not necessary in this at all. Down here, it's got the green heater wires going to the board. I'll move those to the octal sockets like I've mentioned on others. And a lot of bundled stuff. It's really not that dissimilar from the other Reissue stuff. Like other Reissue amps, it's got the screen grid resistors here. It's got a bias measurement resistor here and a diode probably across it. I haven't looked at the schematic for this in a bit. I'll call it up before I start working and all that stuff. All the other components are fine. You know, it's got metal oxides where I'd use carbon film, but that's not going to make or break the performance of an amp. It's not going to break the sound of an amp. It's just going to push it in a direction that I don't think is particularly appropriate for this circuit. It does have the original 6L6s the amp came with. You can see the white logo has become discolored. This yellowish color here over the plates where they get really hot, but they don't show signs of damage. And the sound that I was getting is not necessarily the sound of a bad output tube, though I will be making sure that they're working well. You know, this is one of those things that if I say, hey, that sound is the filter caps, someone's going to argue with me. And I don't have time today to go through a big defense of why I'm going to change out the filter caps. They're inexpensive. It's fairly easy to do. That's either going to be the cause or a major contributing factor. At that point, the amp will be working well. I'm going to get the heaters moved off the board so that we don't have that well-known heat issue on the board toasting things. I'll make sure all the connections are clean. We'll get rid of that noise, and we'll take particular care looking at the bias and B+ of this amp before it goes back out into the world. One of the fixes you can do, which is very easy, rather than doing Zener droppers and all that kind of fun stuff, or great big 20-watt resistors mounted to the chassis, you just change from a GZ34 to a 5U4GB rectifier tube, drop about 30 volts there. As long as the heaters are happy, you know, you can play around with B+, keeping in mind that as you adjust B+, you need to adjust bias, etc., etc. But this will not take any heroic work to get sounding good. And it may go home sounding great with these original tubes. They may need to be changed out for other reasons, but from what I've heard so far, that's filtering, that's predictable stuff, and the IC brand caps just don't tend to last. That said, the Bassman Reissue uses a much longer 22 microfarad cap by Illinois caps than you find in most of the Hot Rods and Blues series amps and the other Reissues. For whatever reason, these tend to last longer than the shorter body ones, though that's no guarantee. Anyway, I'll get some new caps on order, and we will make this thing sound great, and maybe we'll get a chance to hear the Reissue, once it's made as good as possible, up against the 58 original. And to be fair, we'll hear each amp through the same 4 speakers. This one's got the Jensen, the new Jensen Alnico 10-inch Reissues. And the 58's got some from, I believe, 57, 55 or 65, and 60. So it'll be interesting to hear that too. But all that is to come, so stay tuned, and thanks for watching.